Welcome everyone, my name's Mark Kelly, I'm half of the Futures team here at Scotch and Belinda Sorensen at the back as well. So I'd like to welcome you all here tonight you're here to unpack the Morrisby career profile that you've got from your child tonight. So we're going to do that with the help of Barry Darnell, who's down the front here. Barry will explain the profiling system and also answer any questions you have as we go. Barry set up his business career analyst in 2003 and is the distributor of this program all around Australia and New Zealand. There's about 110 schools using this, mainly in the eastern states, and Scotch is the only school in South Australia using this system. Barry has a series of degrees, one in a Master's in Occupational Psychology and various other degrees. He's also, in my experience, a great communicator and should entertain and interest you tonight unpacking this Morrisby profile. So please welcome Barry Darnell.
Hi there. So I'm going to be talking to PowerPoint tonight and step you through what I think should be understood about this profile before you get to your one-to-one discussion with the careers advisors. We could clearly have just given reports to people and you're all capable of reading it, but the idea behind tonight is to help you get behind the words so you can understand the theory upon which it's based. But it's also a dedicated period of time in our busy world to focus on this particular report rather than give it 5 minutes and move on to something else. So, I want to start off by reading a statement of intention. What's it all about? Well, it's to support the process of subject, course and career choice by providing an objective statement of a person's underlying abilities, personality and career interests. Now that's a mouthful, but it's why schools use this system. And I want to say a few words about two phrases in that sentence. Firstly, it's an objective statement. There's an objectivity in this information in that it's based on your sons and daughters' performance on some timed tests conducted in a controlled environment. So it's not the school's view of them, it's not my view of them, and it's largely not their own self-perception. Secondly, it's looking at underlying abilities. Now, it's probably the first time you've seen this style of data on your sons and daughters. You'll have seen lots of academic information, you may have seen scholarship information. This is a little bit different. With this style of testing, we're trying to get rid of the impact of quality education and good teaching, personal motivation, study habits, luck on the day of the exams, etc. To be left with someone's underlying capacity to solve problems presented in different ways. And that means we can say this is looking at measured potential rather than academic attainment. And those two things don't relate particularly well together, depending on how much effort someone's willing to put in. Some people will really outperform measures of potential, and others will really underperform measures of potential. Certainly at school. And this system is based on something called differential ability. And it's not the only careers product or testing product which uses that concept of differential ability. They all have something in common. They're focused far more on what type rather than how much ability a person has. So it's looking at the shape rather than the size of the intellect. And it does that, not that doing well in exams isn't important to get into a wide range of careers, but thriving in a career is a lot more than being smart enough to get into it. And because academic attainment and potential don't correlate particularly well together, we're really focused here on the shape rather than the the shape rather than the size of the intellect. And I'll explain more about that a couple of times as we go through. So, I have to say up front that careers guidance is not an exact or natural science. It's a social science supported by tests and questionnaires. So you wouldn't expect a one-to-one relationship between a particular profile and success and happiness in a particular career. Clearly there are relationships, or people wouldn't bother using this style of testing. And in the longitudinal research that's been done, there's a couple of research studies over 10 years, about 500 students per study. They both point to a little bit over 85% of people ending up in one of the careers listed, or something very, very close. Which means, historically, 15% of people have done something totally different. So that's fine. The other thing I'd point out about a system which is a matching process, we're basically measuring ability, interest, personality, blending that information, and then generating suggestions, so it's a matching process, is that that's not particularly good at predicting where the future of work is going to be, what future jobs are going to be, what future job titles are going to be, because we don't really know yet. However, when you generalize the information, it's still extremely useful for a lot of people in decision making. All right. When people look at something like this, and I've seen it tonight, quite often we'll go to the back and they'll read the suggestions. And we'll either like them or we'll hate them, or maybe somewhere in the middle. I would point out those are just suggestions. They're not a list to choose from. The idea behind all this is to start people building this concept of who they are and what they might be suited to. And I always think that what you do with those career suggestions is, one, categorise them. So you might say there are 3 or 4 looking at the health science industry, 3 or 4 looking at commerce, 3 or 4 looking at humanities-loaded careers or careers in hospitality, etc. So you want to categorise them and see which themes come out. The second thing you want to do is do some research. At the age of 15, 16, everybody would know what a forensic scientist does because they've seen TV. However, the reality of the job is very, very different to the one portrayed by TV. So the idea behind this kind of system is to start people thinking early about what a job might really be like. Not just the car you get or the clothes you wear walking out of the office, but what you do sitting at the desk for 8 to 10 or perhaps more hours a day for year after year after year. So to get them to start thinking about what they might be suited to and how they'd like to spend their life. And that is a process that no testing system can do. But if we imagine students going into a darkened careers library with books, what we're doing here is turning on the flashlight and saying, we think if you look there, there and there, you'll find something you like. So it should be fast-tracking an understanding of where your strengths are, and if you want to use that information, an easy way of finding the kinds of careers which you should be exploring. All the rest of it is going to be down to the students, with parent and everybody else's help, understanding the routes into those careers and thinking about what they'd actually like to do. So I've really said that the system doesn't provide the answer. And it is a document which is most useful when you get past the cursory flick through, it says you'd be good at this. It's about thinking which bits of it might be helpful in decision making. Now I'll be going through a little bit of that tonight, but it is something which I would encourage you to have a good read of, put a coffee cup down on it, nothing wrong with that. Underline the bits you relate to, maybe circle the bits you don't think are right, and then have that information in your head when you have your one-to-ones with careers advisors. I'll also point out that the school have had no input into producing this report. So there's nothing in here where the school has said this student is travelling well in this subject, we'd like them to do that subject. Everything in the report is based on their performance on some timed tests, plus a multiple choice questionnaire. And currently about 40 schools in Australia use the paper version of this. There's an online version which would make up the rest of the students. You've heard about 110 schools use this, so 40 use the paper, the others use the online version. Now, tonight I want to talk a little bit about the principles, about access to this information. We'll then go through the principles and questions at the end. Now, when I say access to information, this really is a confidentiality statement. It is your report. Through your school fees you bought it. And we should be aware, as we look at it, that some people are very happy sharing this information with others, but others might be less so. So before you grab a report, just be aware that some people are more sensitive about that than others. Now, clearly we have a forum like this because it's very time efficient to get a certain amount of information over to a large group, which is why we have a parent evening, but it is a personalised report. Now, the school or the college do have a 5-page summary of your 20-page report, and clearly that's to support ongoing guidance. The focus this year, fair and square on subject selection. But the data doesn't age much as long as people's interests don't change dramatically. So you can revisit this data next year, but also in year 12 and in later years to help students make decisions. And all this information is available online on a password-protected website. If you look at the very first page of your report, there are some login details there with a code. You don't actually need that because the students already have an online login. They completed a questionnaire online, so at the end of tonight we'll release that information and the students can log in. When they log in, they can download a PDF of the report if you want additional copies, but there's also a questionnaire on there which focuses very much on study interests, and that is specifically aimed at Year 12. I won't talk much about it, but be aware that the online login does give access to an additional questionnaire, which I happen to think is fantastic. Really like that online questionnaire. And you could do it now if you wanted, but you'll definitely do it in Year 12. Oops. So what was involved? Clearly the students know this, but the parents might be a little bit uncertain. It started off with a multiple choice interest questionnaire. Sample questions up there, and they were all answered on a 4-point scale. And 4-point scales deliberately don't have a centre point because we don't want people to go down and say, I don't know. We're trying to nudge them off that centre point and say, well, I might fancy this or I might not. There was then a little bit over 3 hours of paper and pencil testing. And that measured 8 aspects of ability and 4 aspects of personal style. We call that personality. And the kind of tests we're talking about, so I now want to talk you through the report, and I'm going to start by looking at the career interests. Now for this, you'll need to be looking at the report as a family, and I'll be talking about the report, you'll be looking at it for the rest of the night. So if you need to shuffle, so the whole family's looking at the report, now's a good time to do that. That is a serious shuffle, one of the bigger shuffles. So, with the career interests, there is detail in the report from pages 9 to 13, going through the various components. But the interests are summarised on page 14, which looks like this. If you could just go to page 14. There are 3 points I'd like to make. Firstly, this is not a summary of the whole report. This is just a summary of that multiple choice questionnaire. Secondly, the thicker the line, the stronger the expressed interest. And this is interest rather than ability, So this person has a thick line coming down towards numerical areas. It doesn't necessarily mean that person's good at that, but they do have an interest in it. And the third point is this is a model of careers, so you won't find every industry or every possible career listed here. There's 620 careers in the database, I think about 60 represented here. So this is a model of careers. And what we're looking at here is the students in particular look at this and say, yeah, that's about me. They might change a bit of thickness of line here or there, but on the whole, if they're saying, yeah, I recognise myself in that, it's job done. The next question is, do the abilities indicate the same strengths as the interests indicate interest? And for that, we'll go to the beginning of the report to page 3. Now, page 3's got 12 bars on it. I'm going to be focusing for most of this evening on the first 6, reasoning down to mechanical. Those 6 bars took 2 hours 50 minutes out of the elapsed 3¼ hour test session. So that was the bulk of the time. And we needed that length of time to acquire a reliable view of the person's performance in each of those areas. So if the students can look the parents square in the eye and say, I put some effort in, nothing went wrong, and if I was to redo it, there's no reason I'd do differently. If they can do that, the chances are you're looking at a reliable and replicatable view of someone's ability level, but more importantly, ability structure or pattern. Now, all the scores you're looking at are normally distributed, which means we can draw that bell-shaped curve over them. And if you go to the bottom of page 2, there's a table describing what that means in percentile or in percentage terms. So essentially, if you have a score in the average category, it puts you in the middle 40% of the comparison group. If you're in the high category, you're in the upper 30%, the very high category, the upper 10%. The comparison group we use is a large, structured sample of people of your age when you did the test. So if you were 15 when you did it, you're compared to 15-year-olds. If you're 16, you're compared to 16-year-olds. And there's also a 14-year-old comparison group. And these groups are about 20,000 in size, structured to represent population demographics, chosen from a much larger database of people who've done the testing. So, some people might have a score which is on or above that solid line on the right-hand side. If so, at that point, the testing's accuracy comes into doubt. However we cut it, you'd be in the top 0.2% of the population, but we don't know where, because you've aced the test. To get a really good sort out of people at that level, we'd need more questions and less time, which we haven't done. All right, let's have a look again at page 3. Now, each of the bars has got a slopey line, a chisel on the end of it. And that represents something called the standard error of measurement. And I'll explain what that means, because it lies at the heart of understanding what differential ability is. Differential ability is not about just using your strengths. It's not just about using the capacities you're good at. There's a language behind it where we take into account the things you're less good at in identifying where your direction of strengths lie. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So we need to know whether one score is actually stronger than another before we make any inferences about it. And that's what standard error of measurement is all about. Essentially, the greater the difference between two scores, the more we make of it in the report. Now here's an example, just so that's clear. When we look at the two green bars, we can see mechanical is slightly stronger than spatial on this occasion. But because of the error in measurement, we're not at all confident that that's the case. If the person had reset the test another day, we might get a different picture. So the system would make nothing of that level of difference. Lower down, with the two yellow bars, there is still a slight overlap. So depending which tests we're talking about, the system may infer something about that level of difference. But the reality is we're not 95% confident that awareness is stronger than flexibility. But if we look up here, under verbal and numerical, unless something went wrong in the testing, and that can always happen, particularly in the earlier tests and the spatial test, then we're comfortable that numerical is stronger than verbal, and the system will make a lot of that in terms of identifying the kind of careers this person will suit. Okay, that's the only technical thing I wanted to cover tonight. Now, what sort of tests are we talking about? Well, this was the first test and also the longest at 30 minutes. There is a string of beads with 2 missing at the end. You have to work out the pattern, get the next 2, choosing from the 8 on the right. This is easy, but they get really hard. You add in more colours, size and shape, and it becomes a very complex task to work out what comes next. It's a measure of abstract reasoning or fluid intelligence, depending on the model of psychology you work with, and I'll talk more about this a little bit later, but let's call it abstract reasoning. Here's an example of one of 2 of a verbal reasoning test. These were both 8-minute tests. The sample questions outlined in red, there are 6 words, 4 form a category and 2 don't fit in. The task is to work out which 2 don't fit in. And here, hammer and blue aren't food types. Now, when you look at the task here, it's clear this is not English ability. There's no grammar here. There's no creative writing, Shakespeare, poetry, etc. All it is the understanding, the precise meaning of fairly everyday words. There is some vocabulary in this, but it's not a test which is heavily reliant on unusual vocabulary. So, of course, clearly, if English is not your first language, you're significantly disadvantaged here. But, assuming it's your first language, we tend to find, or we do find statistically, that people who do well in tests like this tend to enjoy and are good at the verbally loaded subjects at school. English, literature, history, etc., etc. Here's an example of one of 2 perceptual reasoning tests, which is the 4th test on page 4. Now, in this version, again, the question's outlined in red. There are 2 shapes on the left that have a relationship. You have to work that out and then repeat that relationship with the first shape coming from the ABC group and the second shape coming from DEF. And in that first one, the shape is simply halving vertically, so the answer is BD. Now, I think it's a really good question to ask, what's the relevance of being good at this for anything? Never mind subject selection or career choice. But let's reframe or rephrase what it is we're looking at. I called it perceptual reasoning. If instead I said this was about understanding information presented in pictures and shapes and diagrams, hopefully a lot of people will think, well, that's relevant for visual design careers. And you'd be right. But what about the sciences? I'll build up a picture. Let's think about biology as a science. You open a biology book and you see words and pictures. Why would they bother with pictures? Why not just write it? The answer, quite obviously, is that pictures are the best way to present that style of information. And reality is some people are better at working with that style of information than others. So if you can show through some structured testing that you have an innate ability with that, it can only be helpful, both in learning the content of the subject, but then in doing the work that follows on from that later. So biology, words and pictures. What would chemistry be? Words, pictures and numbers. What would physics be? Words, pictures, numbers and mechanical principles, certainly at school level. So you can see if we measure the underlying capacities, we can build a hypothesis, and it never is more than a hypothesis, about the subjects which someone would be good at if they were interested. So, that's the position of perceptual reasoning. Now, let's talk a little bit about some specific tests. If you go to the top of page 4, you get that first bar copied across. That's your reasoning score. And I called it fluid intelligence or abstract reasoning. The best way to describe what this is all about is to say that if someone performs well in this, they've shown a capacity to solve complex problems from first principles. I'll say that again, because it's a good phrase. To solve complex problems from first principles. Doing well in this says very little about how well you'll do academically at school. But if you're going to do a career at some point which is diagnostic in nature, and here I'm thinking about careers involving complex analyses, science, technology, a range of things like that, in those careers there's a constant heavy load of diagnostic work rather than work which is memory-based. So the reality is high levels of this aren't that important for an awful lot of jobs once you've got past the training or the learning phase. And that might be 5 years into your job. But once you're past that, when you think about, let's say a classic thing would be a doctor, you don't go to a doctor for information recall. You go to them for diagnostic information, a capacity to link information together and get it sometimes a novel solution. And that's what this is all about. All right, now let's have a look at the bottom of page 4 where there are 3 tests presented together. And these are the most important, in Morrisby speak, around the direction of talents and the kind of careers that might suit you. So there are only 3 tests out of 12, but for me they're the start point at any discussion. And I'm going to explain how those 3 work by using an analogy. So rather than using intelligence, which is all a bit abstract, I'm going to introduce an analogy of sport. We're going to take 3 aspects of someone's physical body and try and predict the kind of sports they might be good at. So, let's say we're looking for a high jumper. I don't think many people would argue, but at a competitive level, we'd be looking for someone who's tall, or more specifically, someone with proportionately long legs. However, if they all stood at one side of the room, they'd all look a bit different to each other, and one source of information isn't really going to help us predict who'd be good at high jump. We need more detail. So maybe we introduce weight. And clearly people who are tall and light, suited to different sports or positions in a team, and people who are tall and heavy. And you can imagine adding in more variables. Strength, flexibility might all be factors. What I'm using is explosive power. Now this is the capacity of muscles to dump energy quickly and give you that boing to launch off the ground. So if you have a lot of that, something like high jump might suit you well. Person 2 comes along. They look the part with the long legs and the low weight. But when we test them, we find they don't seem to have that explosive power. Instead, their muscle structure seems better suited to endurance events. So for them, something like distance running might work. And it's as simple as that, as a model. Let's have a go. What do we think? Short legs, lots of weight, lots of explosive power. You've been here before. I assume you have, yeah? You know? Oh, occasionally that happens. People come up with shot put, with wrestler, a range of things like that. Now, my point here is that this is not rocket science. We talk physical structure, and it makes a load of sense to people. But if you're going to excel, it's not the only thing, but having a suited physical structure just makes the road easier in particular areas. But how many people think about their sons and daughters having an intellectual structure as well as a physical structure? We've all got one. It's just not measured or talked about. And really that's what Morrisby is doing. They're measuring intellectual structure, tying it up with interests and saying, hey, this might suit you. And it tends to be right, not always, but more often than not. Now, this next point is really key to my personal view, and I know the school's view of how this data works, or should be used. More is not always better. It is an academic world. The ATAR's been king for a lot of time. There's some challenges to it coming up in terms of whether it's the best measure of attainment at school. But it is an academic world, and you will be judged on academic attainment. However, when you go back to that first person, think about what makes this person good at high jump. Part of it is the fact they have low weight. If they had more weight, I could argue, I think quite well, that they'd be a better athlete in general across a broad range of sports. But the low weight makes them suited to the task. And that is key to Morrisby. It's what are you suited to? So, more is not always better. And we're not, with this system, ignoring factors like motivation, opportunity and interest. We're simply choosing to focus on the aptitude component at this point. And finishing off on the analogy, I know if I were in a position of choosing athletes, I'd want access to this kind of objective data, but I wouldn't want to be limited by it or bound to follow the results. And that's exactly how a school will use it. It's one source of information to be considered alongside other sources to support robust decision making. All right, now bottom of page 4, I'm still on these 3 tests. Let's say you're looking at a profile like this with a strong verbal. I'd like you to think about this individual as a 3-legged stool. The longer, stronger leg is the verbal leg. So if you were to sit on that stool, what would happen would be you'd end up balancing on the verbal. So this person is likely to understand and explain the world using words. And they tend to gravitate towards careers where that's important. Given what I've said about perceptual reasoning, it shouldn't surprise you that people with strong perceptual reasoning tend to gravitate towards technology, science and design. And if you want to play with this model a little bit more, if we drop the numerical back so it's equal to verbal, it would be a 1-legged stool. On perceptual, it's far more likely to be design, or perhaps some languages, but more likely design. And if a numerical came up to be next to perceptual, a 2-legged stool, that would be things like IT, engineering, aspects of science, etc. The third model, and the most complex one to get a grasp of. Most people, when they see strong numerical, think good at maths. Quite possibly not. To be good at maths, you'd really benefit from a few things, including high perceptual. So high numerical by itself is more likely quantitative thinking rather than mathematical thinking. Spreadsheet people. People who might want to work in the finance world in some broad area, or with numbers, but not hard maths. But if not, then people who are quite good at organising things and putting in place methods and systems and processes. So your careers, if this is your profile, will be pushing the financy stuff. But I, for example, know of a girl, a daughter of a careers advisor I've known for 15 years, who did the Morrisby profile, and she did a lot of financy stuff. She had a profile like this. She rejected it all, she went into childcare. Qualified in childcare. 2 years after qualifying, she said, actually, I'm much better at organising than working with the kids. So you can use this as a style of work rather than a direction of work. Other profile shapes, that's mine, service to people. Found in the media, in medicine, particularly the GP style, the more hospital doctor style, might be more straight science. And the art world. And then there's the balanced profile. And I'll talk for a couple of minutes about a balanced profile, because probably a quarter of you have this, 26% on average in Australia. And of course you'll know if it's balanced because all 3 bars will have a slight overlap. If that's the case, you've been through 3 hours of testing to be told, congratulations, you're balanced. Now, that's less helpful than it might be, but at least you now know. The fact is, some people are general athletes, good at a wide range of things, but are not a master of one. And that is this profile style. There's actually quite a lot to be said about the careers they move into. They tend to end up in careers which are more generalist rather than specialist. At a high level, it might be management consulting, it might be general management, whatever they do later on in life, because they're using a bit of everything in their work. But the reality is, if you have a balanced profile, all the system has is a vague view of academic level, and it's not great at working at academic level. So what it's really going to be doing is saying, what are you interested in? And if you have clearly defined interests, your career suggestions will follow the interests. And that's fine. If we can't find a direction of strength, do what you want. In fact, even if we find a direction of strength, you should still do what you want, but take this into consideration. All right. Now, there are, I know, a number of students here for whom English is not their first language. I'll just show you in one slide how this might impact your results. Let's say if you'd done this in your own language, this was your profile. Strong verbal. Because you do it in English, the verbal is much lower, and that morphs you in Morrisby speak into a technical commercial area. So the system is going to be pushing careers around that area. Equally, if your true profile is the service to people profile, when you get below verbal, it pushes science. Now, there's not much we can do about this, but we do understand it. And the careers advisors have both been working with this system for many years, and they'll know how to work with you to make sure the system generates results which are worthwhile listening to. But the fact is, if it's not your first language, the verbal is likely to underread. All right, let's move on, and I'll move much faster now. Let's have a look at page 5. 2 bars on page 5. And between them, if you average them, this suggests a general level of practical ability. And the more practical somebody is, the more likely they are to want to use that strength. If you're good at something, on the whole, most people want to use it. But there's also information on that page that talk about the balance of strengths in terms of whether spatial is stronger than mechanical, etc. Now, one of those tests is the spatial. And this is a test which 7% of 15-year-olds just don't get. Being a practical ability, it is trainable. In fact, both the mechanical and the spatial are far more trainable than the first 4 tests. But at the moment, if you've got a really short bar, it suggests you didn't get what the test was about, or simply can't rotate objects in your mind. Wait a couple of years, the chances are you could then, because it will develop. Now, let's have a look at page 6. 3 bars on page 6, and I mentioned before, the bottom of page 4, in my view, is the most useful information in terms of direction in strengths. This page, for me, is the most useful in terms of how you solve problems. And it's made up from the 6 tests we just looked at. The thinking things out bar is just your reasoning score copied across. We then average the verbal, numerical and perceptual and call that using information. And we average the spatial and mechanical and call that using experience. Now, how do you use this kind of information? Well, let's say your particular strength is using experience. What that suggests is that the reason you learn is to be able to do. And your preferred approach to learning is something which is project-based, hands-on, learning for a reason, rather than in a vacuum because you've been told it's good for you. So that could lead to certain styles of subjects at school, but more importantly, it might lead to the kinds of learning style that suggests you might go to one university rather than another, because there's less big lecture theatre stuff and more learning by doing. If using information is the strength, these are the three which correlate most strongly with academic attainment. If that's your standout, the chances are you're pretty good at learning stuff. So, sitting, listening to a talking head like me might work for you. You can learn in a vacuum, apply theory, practical skills later if you needed to. But the learning component sticks for you. If we talk about putting together a bit of IKEA furniture here, the person with the strong using experience will pull it out of the box, and because they're good at this stuff, they've probably done it before, they've taken those opportunities, they'll probably say, well, I can just do this. They might go down a couple of blind alleys, come back, and make it work quite well. Whereas the person with strong using information skills is likely to be saying, why would I solve this? Someone else has done it for me. I'll just follow the instructions. Now, if thinking things out is the strength, then this person's reason for learning is likely to be to understand, not to do. Not sure how many are in this group, but people with that strong thinking things out bar tend to respond well to learning conceptually, rather than being taught by rote and having to repeat information. And that's very useful, particularly in the sciences, when things get harder, because you've got the ability to pick up a concept so much more quickly than others who have to rehearse it more times to get there. All right, page 8. 4 bars on the page, and this is personality. Now, most parents here will have been through a personality questionnaire at some time in life. And in that, you've probably done what I showed in terms of the interest questionnaire. Answered multiple choice questions about your preferred style of behaviour. We haven't used that approach with the students, so we didn't ask them any questions about themselves in order to get to these bars. Instead, we tested them. And normally you'd never use the word test and personality in the same sentence, but that's how Morrisby approached this. And it's interesting because that means the scores you're looking at don't depend on your son's or daughter's self-perception. It's called objective testing. And it's the same model that was used for the abilities. So with the abilities, rather than measuring output, which might be academic attainment, we're measuring the underlying capacities upon which output is built. That's what we're doing with personality. We're measuring the underlying ways of operating upon which behaviour builds. All pretty theoretical. Let's have a look at a couple of tests. So this was probably one of the most fun ones in the test battery. It was all done by stopwatch, and initially they had 5 seconds per line. That turned into 10 seconds per line, and over the page 15. So quite a lot of repetition in this. And these are in sets of 3. So initially, how many S's can you do in 5 seconds? How many S's backwards in 5 seconds? And at this point, all we're doing is working out your motor speed, how fast you can write, which differs for people. Because the real task is when we get to the third one, S forward, S back, S forward, S back, S forward, S back. When you're doing that, your mind has to switch from one task to another. It's called perseveration, and we call it flexibility, and it's an indication of how quickly someone's mind can move from one thing to another. If you have high levels of flexibility, concentrating for long periods of time on one thing can be a challenge. Here's one of 2 tests which feed into the decisiveness score. Now, we have to find catchy one-word descriptors for all this, so decisiveness is the label. But depending on combinations of scores, you might call this initiative, you might call it outward confidence. Technically, it's ideational fluency of ideas. And what the students had to do was in 2 minutes add just a few lines to each of these shapes to turn it into a meaningful drawing and write underneath what it's meant to be. And what happens is some people choke, others just go for it, and what we call divergent thinking rather than convergent thinking kicks in, and people are making stuff up, which is the task. If people can do a lot of that on paper, they're likely to do that in other situations. So if we think about somebody, say, in the advertising world, in the creative end of advertising, if they can't generalize information and get out of the box and make stuff up, it's not very helpful. So this is a measure of that kind of thing. As I say, it could be, we call it decisiveness, but it could be initiative, it could be outward confidence. So those are the kind of tests. Now I'll point out that out of the whole test battery, these kind of tests are inherently less reliable. That is because the students haven't got a clue what they're doing. It's a load of fun, and they're doing it at the end of 2 3/4 hours of intellectually challenging work. So sometimes things go wrong. Normally they don't. Normally it's really pretty insightful. But if it doesn't feel right for you, don't believe it. Rely on those around you who know you way better than this kind of testing to say what they think your personality is like. Now, let's stand back and think what we've collected. We've collected information on ability level, and more importantly structure, career interest, and now personality. We then convert your sons and daughters to numbers, and we blend the information based on the strength of the interest, the clarity of the ability profile, etc., and through an algorithm generate a number of career suggestions. And they're on pages 17 to 19. I know you've looked, but let's have another quick look. Now, because this is a mechanised system, inevitably there is an order, and these are in order of those which Morrisby reckoned would suit you better. I'd urge you to ignore that. No system is fine enough, and we're not measuring everything we possibly could, to be at all confident of the ordering here. Think about all of these suggestions as suited, including those on the right, which are associated careers, but they all suit you in different ways. Now, I'm pretty sure half of you will be looking at this and thinking, yeah, that's exactly what I thought, didn't need to do this, just told me what I knew. If that's the case, great. It's like going along to a doctor's for a health check and getting a tick. Nothing wrong with that at all. But if you're looking at this list and you're thinking, well, I get where 3, 4, maybe 5 of these come from, but where did you dredge up the rest? I just don't see those working. Probably one of two things has happened. Either interests and abilities are simply saying different things. If that's the case, what are we meant to do? Well, what we do is we push out as many careers which allow for that blending as we can, and then with the remainders, we'll be pushing out a few which focus on your interests, which of course you'll like, and a few focusing on your abilities, which you probably won't at the moment. The other reason people don't relate to the career suggestions is that perceptual reasoning wildcard. If you'd walked in the room tonight and I'd met you and said, hi, how's your perceptual reasoning? Not a lot of people would have known, because it's not a capacity that's really measured. So if that turns out to be higher than you might have thought, the system would be pushing more careers, particularly in the science areas, science technical areas than you've been thinking. If it's lower than you might have thought, the system will push less of the sciences and more around the commerce and the humanities areas. So that's how it works. Now, at the end of the day, it is a discussion document, and you will be using it in class to think a little bit about whether it feels right, which bits you take on, which bits you don't. There is an online exploration component of it. If you log in, you can do a lot of research. We spend a lot of time getting links to careers information, which are better than Google do, probably. So we're going through all the, I guess, the legitimate, well thought through careers information sources and summarising them. So you can get an objective view of what the careers are. And they include videos, etc. So in terms of research, I'm certain the school intranet will have a careers portal with careers information, but you can also log in and have a look at some of this stuff. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is a sheet that you don't have with your report, but you will get the subject selection. We don't give it to you now because it's too easy to misinterpret. And it's going to be used as a check on subject selection. I'll explain quickly how it works. Based on that multiple choice interest questionnaire, Morrisby work out which subjects you're more and less likely to be interested in. And that generates the order of a subject list. It'll be different for everybody. You then add in the abilities and personality to generate career suggestions. Now, some of those career suggestions either have assumed knowledge or there might be prerequisites to get into certain courses, although there's less of those than there used to be. There's certainly some subjects are considered more useful to get into certain courses than others. So based on that information, Morrisby derive a line. The longer the line, the more important the subject is to keep all the doors open for these career suggestions. So what the school will be doing will be saying, well, you like English, it's really important, you've got to do it anyway, let's move on. They then get to art. Now, art doesn't seem that important for the career suggestions. However, you really, really like it, so maybe you should do it. However, down lower, there is a media communication suggestion here. If that's offered at school, and no school offers all of these, but if that was offered at school, might media communications be a better match for you than art? Let's talk about it. If you talk about it and say art, fine, but let's talk about it. Then lower down, you have biology. By definition, because it's lower in the list, you're not that interested. However, it seems to be fairly important for a number of those careers. So let's talk about the implications of not taking biology. That's how this will be used, rather than saying, pick the ones with long lines. That's all I wanted to say. I'm going to pass over to Belinda Sorensen. Thanks very much.
Wow, what an amazing collection of information, and what a brilliant starting point for the careers exploration journey that we'll be going through with the students. So where to from here? On Monday, we're taking all of the Year 10s to the Adelaide Careers and Tertiary Studies Expo in the city, just to dip the toes in the water and explore some of these career suggestions and anything else that they might see that they want to find out more about. Then, throughout term 2 and 3, all Year 10 students will have a one-on-one interview with either Mark Kelly or myself based on the house that they're in to talk through their Morrisby results. On Thursday the 28th of June, we'll be having a Future Pathways or Future Planning evening for all Year 10 parents, and we encourage the students to come along too. And that's to talk about subject selection going into Year 11 and 12 to keep open as many future pathway options as possible. So this is just the start of a process. We think it's important that we started in Year 10, and it's a conversation that will keep happening over the next few years. But could you please join with me in thanking Barry again for his presentation. Thank you very much for coming along, and if you'd like to hang around, if you have any questions for Barry, he will be here just briefly. So thank you very much.